everyone, this is Siddharth and I scored a 715 on the GMAT focus, which is 99th percentile. And of course, I would like to thank Target Test Prep a lot because it was one of the major sources which I utilized during my journey. But before delving deep into it, I'll give a quick brief about myself, what my background is. So essentially, I graduated in 2020 from NMIMS Bombay. I did like bachelor's in science of economics with a major in finance. From there on I worked in consulting. I worked with one of the MVPs for approximately 3 years. Took a bit of a break because I was pretty burnt out towards the end, and that is when I started thinking about my future, what I wanted to do. Naturally, one of the next steps after you've worked in MVP is to start thinking about a global MBA. The reason why I say global MBA is because I've always wanted to get global exposure, and since I'm generally very passionate about businesses, I feel targeting one of the M7s is something which I wish to do. Now, naturally, when I started speaking to the counselors, the questions started emerging with respect to my GMAT. For context, I think around 2020 I'd given the classic GMAT and I did a bunch of self-prep and I managed to score like a 710. However, with my ambitions of M7, which I just talked about, that score, from an overrepresented category, male Indian, is something which wasn't enough. So I started exploring sources online and I realized that where I was particularly lacking was in exhaustive structure, right? Because even when I did it back in the day, I got a lot of content from my friends, but of course that wasn't enough because I was not able to double down on how can I go from, let's say, a 710 to a 750 or a 760 which I was targeting. So that's the brief with respect to what my background is and what my target is. Right now I'm working at a health tech startup and I intend to apply for the batch of 2026. My first GMAT mock score, right? So right after I left my job and I decided to give the GMAT, I gave a mock and I scored around a 645, which is roughly a 700 equivalent. Now my target honestly was a 695 at the very least, so I studied for a month or so through the original guide, but I did not really see a lot of improvements in the mocks that I gave subsequently as well. So I decided that, since I have some time on my hands because of the sabbatical, I will do a more targeted and focused, or rather take a more targeted and focused approach to it. So naturally I went on Reddit, I started reading up online with respect to what are the more common courses, and since I had a lot of time on my hands, I think I did read a lot of good reviews with respect to Target Test Prep, the way in which they structure their course, the way in which the whole how detailed the whole piece is, and I decided to take the leap of faith, and luckily it turned out pretty well for me. The reason why I decided to eventually choose TTP is, of course, beyond the reviews, I also spoke to a bunch of folks. And I took the free trial, and the free trial itself was super structured, right? And as someone who knew that I'm going to give like 3 to 4 hours a day to the prep, I realized that Target Test, does the whole calendar thing for you where they tell you what are the tasks at hand. They also give you the tests after each chapter to gauge where you stand. There's also accuracy, etc., which is part of the fray, which essentially keeps you very focused, right? All you need to do is focus on doing, like reading and getting things right, and the logistics side of it, the organizing side of things, the planning side of things is already taken up by them. The other piece which I, as part of my trial, which I liked, is they had a bunch of cheat sheets as well, which are super relevant, the day before the exam, etc. They're pretty handy. How long did I use TTP for? So I started my prep around February, and I ended up giving the GMAT focus a couple of times before my third attempt. Just sharing my experience with that, I realized that after my first attempt, I needed to do a more focused and targeted effort towards my quant. I seem to be knowing the concepts pretty well, but the hacky way in which you need to solve questions which are there in the original guide is something which I was lacking. So what I would recommend, honestly speaking, is after you're done with TTP, make sure you're very proactive with respect to the whole original guide approach as well. Supplement your target test prep with original guide questions, because what that essentially does is the OG is a pretty good reflection of the kind of questions you'll get on the day. What target test prep will do, they'll crystallize your concepts that are in place, and a combination of two is pretty lethal. I was super confident with respect to my Quant. So that's one takeaway which I would recommend. The other thing which I would say you need to be sort of wary of while preparing through target test prep is, see, the course is super detailed, right? And of course there are multiple topics as part of GMAT in Quant, in verbal, in DI. So being intentional with respect to knowing what your weaknesses are, right? Because what I did is, of course, I went through the entire 20 chapters, and of course it ended up being quite time consuming. But having said that, knowing as you were, let's say, doing some practice on OG or doing some practice tests through target test prep itself, you will realize that there are certain concepts where you typically lack, right? For me, I realized towards the latter part of my journey was more complex algebraic equations, right? Distance and speed is something which I sort of was also struggling with. So having identified those weaknesses, I think the logical next step is you have a very detailed chapter within target test prep for all these things, where they also talk about strategies which are super helpful. So I'm saying an alternate way to approach this entire thing is, of course, while the whole suite, the whole gamut of chapters are there on target test prep, just be a little more introspective and proactive in trying to figure out, where is it that you typically tend to go wrong. And this is, of course, applicable across verbal and DI as well. But okay, now coming back, right? This was after my first attempt where I realized that, okay, I was particularly lacking on that side of Quant. And I was not super convinced. I was expecting a higher score. I only got a 675. So then I realized that, okay, let's ramp up. So I did a lot of targeted practice in Quant, etc. And in my next attempt, I got a 685, where Quant was super off, like super bang on. But verbal RC is something which I realized I was relatively, struggling with. So again, I spoke to the folks at Target Test Prep, a couple of friends who were also prepping, and the conclusion was, and this is going to be helpful for you if you're just starting out, doing a lot of untimed practice for verbal. Okay, now for verbal, what's critical is nailing the concepts down, because if you nail the concepts down, eventually the timing will take care of itself, right? It'll take you a month and a half. I did like 10 passages a day, not bearing in mind the time. And as it turns out, this was super helpful, right? Because I ended up scoring 100 percentile, luckily, on my reading comprehension during my third attempt. So the whole objective, or if I were to summarize my journey, this is something which I started doing late, but this is something which TTP already does for you, is error tracking. So be very intentional when it comes to error tracking. Start noticing common themes with respect to which topical practice is something which is a bit of a weakness for you, where, like, what quality of questions do you typically get wrong within those, like, let's say topical themes. Also, what are the sub themes where you typically struggle? There's a data sufficiency element to it as well. When you're prepping for Quant, of course you won't prep for data sufficiency and problem solving separately, right? There's going to be the same inherent concepts at the end of the day. Like, since I've gone on a monologue here, I think the third aspect right now is the thing which I very liked a lot about TTP was data insights. There's not a lot of content, since this is something which is fairly new to the GMAT, right? The way in which the course is structured, the way in which you have the depth of questions, I personally found them super useful. And when I practiced through the original guide, when I practiced through TTP, I realized that the questions are pretty similar. So if you feel that DI is something which you lack in, I think you must use TTP for that as well. Now, if I were to, let's say, give any other personal advice to you, it would be patient with yourself, right? Because I had a particular timeline in my mind that, okay, I need to, let's say, give my GMAT by June. But then I realized after giving a couple of mocks is that I wasn't really ready. So what's the point in shelling out $200 odd a pair for a GMAT attempt, only for it to not be, for it to not be very fruitful, and also sort of continue to impact your confidence? Because having, like, I would like to say that as well as you can simulate the environment in your mocks, the test day experience is a little different altogether, right? There are bigger nerves, and like personally, me who's given, let's say, 3 attempts on the focus, towards my 3rd attempt also I was nervous, right? Let's say, I'll give you an anecdote only. For my quant, I managed to get the first 19 questions right. I had like 18 questions right rather, and I had a good 12 to 13 minutes on my hand. But since I was, let's say, so excited with respect to the fact that, okay, I've nailed most things, I have a lot of time on my hands, GMAT threw, let's say, a bit of a turner for me, and it took me a lot of time to get the 19th and the 20th question. And despite shelling out more than 5 minutes on each of them, I didn't get them right. So I think it's very critical that before you decide to finally attempt for your GMAT, you were able to comfortably solve your questions as part of your mocks. And you also need to have a bit of a buffer. So for context, before I attempted my 3rd GMAT focus, I got like a 745, I got a 755, and even like the lowest that I got was a 715 GMAT mock. So just to basically put things in perspective, whatever it is that you get in mocks, I would say, just to be prudent, ensure that is a score that you will be happy with if you attempt it as part of the actual exam. Because of course you'll hear stories where people magically get more, let's say, people are different, right? But just to be more prudent, I would say that's a very practical thing you should be wary of. And yeah, to summarize, I would say TTP was very helpful throughout this journey. Scott, Jeff, etc. super responsive on chat. The kind of content, the level of depth that is available as part of Target Test Prep is superb. The third thing is, of course, while it's a double-edged sword, since the content there is so much depth, it's very critical to be structured, but B, at the same time, be very intentional with respect to what is the resource that you want to leverage. So that is what I would say, be tactical about. And fourth is, of course, it's a test at the end of the day. So my recommendation is, don't let it get to you too much, because when you're in the flow, when you're more confident, that is when you'll see the best results. And just enjoy, because it's a very fun experience. I particularly like aptitude tests. So I wish you the best. You can reach out to me if you have any questions. And thanks everyone.